And EWTN is reporting on this because the Spanish bishops had to come out and make a statement because this outlet called El País, I believe, in Spain, put out a report saying that in his private, essentially, meeting with the Spanish Bishops' Conference, Pope Leo XIV was being filled in on things by the Spanish bishops who were discussing several issues regarding the church in Spain, regarding conflicts with the government, regarding investigations on abuse issues, that sort of thing. And then Pope Leo, allegedly, according to two sources familiar with the matter, is who El País was citing. Pope Leo kind of listened to all this and said, actually, my biggest concern is not all these, serious issues. Actually, my biggest concern is the far right and how they're trying to steal the Catholic vote. More or less, that was the statement. This was reported, again, by El País, just citing two anonymous sources. And a lot of people jumped on this, especially a lot of traditionalist sources, but also a lot of liberal sources, liberal Catholics, who wanted to jump on, Pope Leo's calling out the far right. He's calling out the far right, quote unquote. Now, I personally am not all that well up on the situation with the far right in Spain from what I've seen. They have the Vox party. There might be some other smaller ones. They don't seem particularly always aligned with the Catholic position on things, so they're not really, this sort of Catholic group necessarily that's being maligned as sort of just Nazi or something like that. I don't really know those details specifically, but the left here in the West was very quick to jump on, Pope Leo's calling out those evil right-wingers. And then the Spanish bishops had to come out and say, no, Pope Leo did not make any statement like this about any particular group. What they said was, quote, the Holy Father reflected, among other things, on the risks of subjecting faith to ideologies without mentioning any specific group. And I don't want to totally toot my own horn on this, but when I first saw this report, I thought, okay, that's disappointing that he's sort of actually attacking the far right. And then I had a thought, do we know this actually happened? This is two anonymous sources. I read the article more carefully. Again, it was in translation because this was from a Spanish outlet. And just everything I saw from it was, this seems a little suspect. My spidey senses are tingling on this one. And lo and behold, over the weeks, as this is over the course of the week, as this is getting covered, many other reports come out saying the bishops came out and said, no, he didn't say that. And the full conference came out and made a statement saying, nope, he never said that. And that really does fit because that's been Pope Leo's approach so far. He doesn't make those kind of specific call-outs. The language, the wording, the report, it didn't really fit. And this is, I think, a good lesson for us.
Yeah, but what's funny about it is that the report is itself guilty of what Pope Leo was actually warning about.
Yes.
Because what those people heard was, he's coming against the far right, because they attribute ideology to simply far right, which is their enemy, right?
Exactly.
And so they sort of heard that mentally. I'm giving them the charity of the fact that they're not lying. So that's what they sort of interpreted. And in doing so, in being so ideological, they did exactly the very thing that he was warning about.
Yes, exactly. And this is, I think, a very good lesson for those of us who care about orthodoxy and who are praying for the church hierarchy to always be following church orthodoxy. And the lesson is that we should not trust every report that comes out, and we should especially not trust reports from these liberal-leaning outlets, because they are more than happy to see things only in their light and promote things in what they believe and in their ideology. And we should not just assume that because we want to, or we have an instinct to believe the worst about the church hierarchy. It's a terrible, terrible state of mind to be in, where we're always willing to believe stories like this, that we're always ready to believe the worst. And it's not to say that Pope Leo hasn't shown that he, does criticize when he sees things as being pulled in an ideology. We've covered how there's definitely there's political friction, for example, between the Vatican and the United States, the Trump administration. We've covered that sort of thing. That sort of thing is obvious. But Pope Leo has made a point of being careful to not call out in specific directions, for better or worse, unfortunately. But that is his modus operandi. And so the fact that we are willing to always, I say we in terms of people who lean towards traditionalism or orthodoxy in general in the Catholic faith, we're so willing to just believe the worst out of any member of the church hierarchy, to just hop on these stories that are unsourced, really. Just two anonymous sources are claiming this, and it turns out to really just be propaganda. We need to be very careful about that, because it's falling into this very harmful, spiritually, mentality of always believing the worst, no matter what the source is. So I think it's a good lesson for all of us.
It is, and it seems like Pope Leo has a very sort of phlegmatic personality, and a lot of us wish that he didn't.
Sure,
So
exactly.
he's very slow, he's very calm, he's very nuanced. He doesn't make sort of more extreme statements ever, and we all kind of want him to be a lot more staunch and confident and, announcing these things. That's just not who he is.
No.
We're finding that out.
You and I both want him to be a little more choleric, like us, right?
Yes, exactly.
We want him to be going out there and getting after it, and that's not his style. That's not his temperament. And I do think there is a good side to that, personally. I think that that actually may, in the long run, prove far more helpful to the church and helping get the church back on stable ground, even if it can be frustrating when we say, oh, why can't you just go right out and excommunicate these heretical German bishops or something like that, whatever judgment call we're trying to make as laymen. It may actually prove better in the long run, thinking in terms of history and thinking in terms of how slowly the church does move in general, to not want to be turning the wheel so far over that the ship of the church really gets all off kilter. We want things to be stable and sustainable. We want long-lasting good change. There was a really fascinating article that came out around, it may have been before Pope Leo was actually elected, but after Pope Francis's death, talking about Cardinal Fernandez saying that the Pope understands that any changes that need to be made, paraphrasing his words, in the church need to be done slowly, because that's the only way that they will take root and have long-lasting effects. Any changes need to be done slowly and gradually. You can't just go whole hog, right off the bat type of thing. And it was a really fascinating article and it was from an author who was saying, this is probably what's going to be needed to do any corrections that we see in the church. That if there's anywhere where the human, the fallible humanity of the church has gotten off track, that making these reforms, these good reforms, these returning to orthodoxy and tradition, it'll need to be done slowly so that it takes root. And that's my inclination. That's my thought of what the benefit will come in historical hindsight, maybe further on, maybe even past our lifetimes, of how things improved, how things kind of changed course in the church, is through that slow, gradual change that lets it take root. But
you can't forget that it's a 2,000-year body.
Yes, yeah.
And so I've heard it said somewhere that to understand the church, it's best to reflect upon it in centuries rather than in years. And that gave me a lot of peace, because I think that if we over-focus on this moment and what the Pope is doing right now, we lose our perspective on this 2,000-year institution, and we can lose our peace because of it.
Yes, we have a long history of plenty of popes who either personally did not present the best example, the most saintly example, whether or not, even if they were very orthodox in what they said publicly, privately, they were not the best examples. Or even popes who just said off the cuff these things that are very questionable when we think, oh, wow, that pope was perfectly orthodox and had no issues. If you really dug down into what they maybe said offhand, what they wrote privately, you're like, oh, that's a little odd. That doesn't quite mesh up. There's a long history of that sort of thing. And we forget that because we're so in the moment. We're so in the moment with media. And it's a good reminder to us that really the only thing that is immediately important to us is our souls, our salvation, and trying to reach out to our immediate neighbor, to those next to us, to those that we know we can affect. Or if you have some sort of presence on media like you and I do, we need to try and reach people who are listening to us. But in a way, that's our neighbor in a slightly more indirect sense. That's the only thing that's immediately important to us.
You're right, but we shouldn't look at the Pope and expect them to act like a U.S. president. How many executive orders can I pass before the next guy gets in and tries to undo them?
Yeah.
And we can fight it in the courts. And, it's like one extreme and it flips the other way. Like, we shouldn't want that from the church. You know, I think there's a part of us that kind of does. If we're just going in the right direction, it's fine. But it does result in this instability when the church should be just that source of calm, that source of peace.
It's what Bishop Eric Varden was saying in his Lenten retreat for the Curia. As we discussed yesterday, the church is 2,000 years, doesn't need to be focused on the moment, focused on the sort of zeitgeist. It's got this timeless, ancient quality that it needs to keep returning back to. It doesn't mean it's supposed to ignore the world as we're in it. That's where we're living. We do need to address it in certain ways, and we've certainly talked about that on the show. But that shouldn't be the center of everything. The center of everything always needs to go back to the timeless, the eternal truth of our Lord and the truth of the Catholic faith. So, in any case, this story I think is a good reminder to us of even just something as simple as check your sources. Please check your sources and realize what anonymous sources are and what alleged means, and just always look at what someone's motive might be when you're seeing them report on something. Don't be so hasty to just make a quick judgment. It's maybe if you are in private, that's understandable, but don't go out then spreading it just by reflex. Make sure you check your sources and think about things. It's a good lesson for all of us to think more. So